How's it going, guys? Balder here, and I am currently in Afghanistan. And before you think that maybe I'm making a video that is insensitive, or maybe I am, understand that there's a reason why I'm flying here. So, as you all know, on the 15th of August 2021, Kabul fell to the Taliban. U.S. forces, last time I checked, are currently in retreat as of recording of this video, and as it stands, I mean, to put it bluntly, the United States lost. And it's kind of a weird thought because when we got into Iraq, I was 13 years old. 9/11 happened just before my birthday. And in a sense, it's really weird to think about it because most of my life I have been living in the United States that's been in this perpetual war. So it is a weird feeling. And what I've seen is that there are a lot of people who have differing opinions on the war in Afghanistan, how things are going, what should have been done, who's to blame, all this stuff. And I want to put in my 2 cents and then tell you, first and foremost, that Afghanistan is a very unique place. It is a whole different animal when it comes down to it. And what do I mean by that? Well, there are a lot of people who are saying that we should have stayed in Afghanistan, or that withdrawing was the worst thing ever. And there's been some criticism, mostly from the right, towards Biden about withdrawing troops. But I've seen other people voice their disagreements with it as well. For me, I am, well, I'm glad for a few things. Even though the United States lost the war, I feel that our troops are going to be a lot safer now that we're no longer in this war. And I also think that we're probably going to be safer in terms of whether or not we're going to succumb to a terrorist attack. Because that's another concern that I saw. I don't think that's very likely, though terrorist attacks do happen, so it wouldn't surprise me. Needless to say, what you need to understand about Afghanistan is that the United States was going to lose. It wasn't Biden's fault. It wasn't Trump's fault that we lost. It wasn't Obama's fault that we lost. It wasn't even Bush's fault that we lost, though it is Bush's fault that we did get into this war in the first place. And out of anything, I do have to criticize the previous 3 presidents for staying in Afghanistan. We never should have. Now, don't get me wrong. I do think it's absolutely terrible that Afghanistan is going to be run by the Taliban, who are incredibly fundamentalist, who are Wahhabists. They are generally pretty extreme, and women's rights are going to go down. Sharia law is going to be a lot more strict and prominent, and it is going to be a hotbed for terrorists. That is all unfortunate, but the problem is that it was inevitable. And why do I say that? Well, take a look at the people who tried to invade Afghanistan. You had the Soviets back in the 1980s. They, aside from the US, were probably the most famous empire to try to take on Afghanistan, and they lost. Mind you, their weapons were pretty advanced. They had laser-guided munitions. They had the latest and greatest Soviet equipment, though by now, obviously, the Soviet equipment is by no means comparable to today. But at the same time, it shows that their equipment wasn't enough. And then 100 years, well, actually not 100 years before that, in the late 1800s, the British tried to colonialize Afghanistan in order to prevent Russia from taking over Afghanistan. Ironic, I know. And it failed as well. So when you look at those 2 empires who were very powerful for their time, And then you look at the United States, I mean, you can kind of put two and two together. Now, the reason for that isn't dogma. It isn't this curse laid upon Afghanistan. And honestly, there are a lot of people who are saying that this is like Biden's Vietnam. Trust me, this is nothing like Vietnam for many reasons. In fact, I would argue that America was more likely to win in Vietnam than they were in Afghanistan. And there are reasons. It isn't just, this curse like it's a graveyard of empires. No, that's not the case. The reason being is because of geography. In Vietnam, yes, you had very dense jungles. The terrain was against the Americans. But they also had problems at home. People didn't want to be in that war. And the US government's reaction to the protesters only made it worse. Not only that, but the person in charge was an absolute despot. Diem. It's either Diem or Diem. I'm going to call him Diem because I believe that's how it's pronounced. Diem was not a good person, and he was so bad that Buddhist monks would rather light themselves on fucking fire than to live under that regime. So, yeah, they had a motivation. They didn't want the South Vietnamese government to take control, and the US was seen as, forcing its ideology upon the country. And in a way, it's very similar to Afghanistan, but I do have to say the Karzai government and his successor were probably a lot better than Diem. So that's one thing. Not only that, but protests didn't get to incredibly violent, levels of protest. And so with that said, there wasn't a huge amount of pressure to withdraw from Afghanistan compared to what we saw in Vietnam. So, yeah, I mean, there's a reason why we lost Vietnam, but in Afghanistan, we just withdrew, and all of a sudden, the people who didn't, the Taliban, pretty much took over in a matter of 8 days. That was it. And I need to increase my throttle to make sure I don't crash into a mountain. Which brings me to my second point. The terrain in Afghanistan is completely different from the terrain in Vietnam. In Vietnam, the dense jungles definitely made it harder for Americans, but some of it was manageable. Here, this isn't the case. In fact, I'm not even sure that this plane can even, scale the mountains. It is so freaking high. And the reason is because this mountain range is called the Hindu Kush. So the Hindu Kush is basically an extension of the Himalayas. 100 million years ago, India slammed into Asia, and it created the Himalayas. And this is the western end of it. These are very high mountains. And if you think about it, let's say that we have two canyons right here, right? So let's say that I am in a tribe that lives here, and there is another tribe that is just over this mountain. So what does that mean? Well, to put it simply, it means that there is a lot of isolation. It means, oh, by the way, this isn't even the tallest part. Trust me, we're not even at, oh yeah, we are at 10,000 feet. But trust me, this is nowhere near the highest, so I do have to get below the clouds so I don't slam into any cumulal granite. But imagine this. There are a lot of different tribes in Afghanistan. One of them happened to be, in support of the Soviet Union. So that's one of the reasons why the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, to prop them up. But there are so many different types of tribes. There are so many different types of people, ethnicities. They're all completely different. They are all isolated, and they don't always agree on everything. So to have this type of national unity, you're basically thinking about a country in the European or maybe East Asian, in the East Asian sense. But in reality, that couldn't possibly be further from the truth. See, you have farms over here. What makes you think that this farming community is going to go all the way to, communicate with the farmers over there? If they do have talks, then what's going to happen is that it's going to be very rare, very uncommon. Maybe it's going to be for trading or diplomacy, but it's going to be very isolated. And this brings up another problem, because while I'm comfortably flying through these canyons in the air, you also need to understand trekking through here via vehicles such as tanks, APCs, or even Humvees and whatnot, it's not really that feasible. It's going to be incredibly difficult to do so. Does it mean it's impossible? Well, almost. In fact, as it stands right now, I'm going to have to fly in this canyon to prevent myself from crashing. So yeah, it's very isolated. It's very diverse. You're not going to be able to control this. There are ambush points all over the place. There are cave systems. Tora Bora comes to mind. It's going to be incredibly difficult to get vehicles through. And airstrikes are frankly not going to be that effective, because if you were to strike one side of a mountain, then you have to deal with the people at the other side of the mountain. It's also sparsely populated in these mountain ranges. To put it simply, it's not going to be achievable by any stretch of the imagination. And that's what I'm trying to get to you. It doesn't matter who gets into Afghanistan. It doesn't matter if it's the Soviets. It doesn't matter if it's the Americans. It doesn't matter if it's the Chinese, if they're stupid enough to try. You can't take over Afghanistan. Or you can take Afghanistan over, but you're not going to be able to hold it. Eventually, the only sphere of influence you're going to have are the city centers. Anything rural, small communities, small farms, small sheep herders, that's not something you're going to be able to control. And seeing how vastly spread out everyone is in Afghanistan, Kabul is really the only major city center. I mean, there are others, but in terms of being modernized, it's pretty much Kabul. That doesn't mean that these people are idiots or cavemen or underdeveloped. It just means that they don't really lived in a civilized society. You'd have to be smart in order to live in places like these. In fact, we are 14,000 feet. If this was an aircraft, well, this obviously is an aircraft, but if this were any type of aircraft flying this high, then you would have to provide supplemental oxygen to everyone. In here, it's not exactly a big issue. See, we have ourselves oxygen tanks. But it does bring up the point. These mountain ranges are insane. Geography matters. There's a reason why Hitler never invaded Switzerland. There's a reason why Mongolia doesn't have a navy. Yeah, and there's a reason why the Americans dug up a canal in Panama. It's because of geography. Geography is very important, especially when it comes to warfare. If you don't understand that, then you're not going to succeed. And in the case of Afghanistan, I mean, it really does suck. I do feel sorry for the people living in Afghanistan. I feel sorry for the people living in Kabul. I feel sorry for the women who are going to be stripped of their education, and maybe the female teachers who are going to be punished for teaching women. It's absolutely horrible, but the problem is that what exactly can we do about it? I want to leave this on a note. I do think it's kind of sad that we are leaving Afghanistan, but in light of very terrible things, I am glad that our troops are being sent home. because at the end of the day, we weren't accomplishing much. WikiLeaks showed that the war in Afghanistan was not going as well as the government was telling us. And when it came down to, combat, the Taliban weren't exactly affected. They could just move where the US Army wasn't. They tried open combat with the Soviets, and it failed miserably. They weren't going to try it with the US. They were going to try hit-and-run tactics. And at the end of the day, those hit-and-run tactics eventually won out. As shitty as it is, wish things could be different, though the solution is not staying. That is the problem. We couldn't stay. It doesn't matter if we left in 2004. It doesn't matter if we left in 2012. It doesn't matter that we left today. And it wouldn't matter if we left in 2030, 2040, or 2050. You are not going to win Afghanistan. It's too geographically diverse. So the best case scenario that we could come up is that we'd have to withdraw our troops. Our troops will be safe, no longer in a combat zone. And then, at least we can have peace in that regard. Anyway, yeah, this is a heavy topic. I understand that. But for anyone thinking about invading this country, don't. Just leave it be. And I guess to leave it on one more note, I do have to say Afghanistan is not doomed to be this backwards Islamic state that mistreats women and minorities. In fact, it could be the exact opposite. Kabul was actually a great place in the 1960s, and I firmly believe it can happen again. It's just that at this point in time, the majority of people in Afghanistan appear to not want that. If they wanted that, then they wouldn't have, then they wouldn't have, just submitted so quickly. They would have put up more resistance, and they did, but by nowhere means to a point. It took 3 months for Vietnam to fall. It took 8 days for Afghanistan to fall. So think about that.